Hi class! I wanted to talk a little bit about the development of anxiety disorders, specifically about adaptive and maladaptive anxiety, and then also what the prevalence is and how these disorders start. So the very first thing that you've seen in other places, such as your readings and in other videos, is that we have a differentiation between anxiety and fear. So anxiety itself is usually something that we're anticipating. So things like our anticipation of a test that's coming up, right? We might be anxious about that test. Or we can also have a present fear, and a fear response is usually built by the fight or flight response. So things like having our heart beat quickly and such. So one of the things that I really want to talk about is how adaptive is it to have anxiety and fear? And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense for us to actually have some anxiety and fear about things. While this child here is very fearful of a black rabbit, in general, we might want to be fearful of things like rattlesnakes, right? That could put me in danger if I encounter a rattlesnake and I don't do anything about it. Or if I have fears about things like heights, that might actually be very adaptive. I don't want to go near a ledge and accidentally fall over and die. So there is this explanation that is evolutionary that says that some anxiety is adaptive, right? If I consider our major things that we might fear, things like animals and deadly plants and poisons, right? Those are all things that make a lot of sense to have as a fear. And what you'll see is that a lot of the main phobias actually do come about because of very evolutionarily important fears. And so when we really think about this, children developmentally will show different types of fears depending on the age. So in early infancy, it's very common to be fearful of strangers, right? Stranger anxiety is something that we see, and that actually shows us that there's an attachment. And a lot of that intense sensory stimulation or unexpected events, right? If you have something loud that happens, it makes sense for that baby to be fearful of it. Toddlers oftentimes have fears about things like the dark and different types of animals. And it kind of makes sense, right? I can't see in the dark, or animals I might be fearful of them because I'm not exactly sure how to interact with these animals. In the preschool years, you often see, that first time leaving parents for preschool, they might have that fear of separation. But it's also common to have a fear of death. So for example, my niece, her grandfather passed away when she was in that preschool age. And she talked a lot about death and about dying because she was so fearful of it. Now that she's a little bit older, she doesn't have that same relationship and doesn't feel the same way about another family member passing away. In school, you start to see a lot of those like natural disasters, different types of school anxiety, performance anxiety. And then once we get into adolescence, so those teenage years, we really start to see a lot of that social interactions that teens start to be fearful of. So these are common things. And so this is what we mean by that developmentally appropriate, right? It may be developmentally appropriate to fear separating from your family members when you're in the preschool age. However, if this continues into your teenage age or your adolescence, that might show that this is developmentally abnormal. It's deviant when we consider that. So this might be something for you to think about. How do we know when that fear is reasonable? Or how do we know that it's the start of an anxiety disorder? And parents need to think about this a bit. So if we want to talk about different types of things, we can talk about adaptive anxiety. It's beneficial to us. It makes sense for us to be a little bit anxious about a test. that helps us to prepare for that test because now we're more likely to actually put that test on. We might actually study for the test, for example. Or it could be something about an immediate threat. So if I start to become fearful of a cliff because I'm right on the edge of a cliff, that might help me deal with that immediate threat. But it becomes maladaptive once we're talking about one's fear that is intense, fear that is chronic, or that interferes with functioning. So it's the same thing that we've been talking about with the 4Ds.